Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and I want to do a two-part video series where I talk about some of my biggest pet peeves of 10th edition. Now, I don't necessarily want this to be a big poo-poo on 10th. I really want to address the things that I feel are holding back the game from being even better and super great. Obviously, 10th is very popular at this point. There's a lot of people enjoying it. It's bringing in more players than ever before, but that doesn't mean it's not without its flaws. And so I want to address those, especially talking about terrain and how this all kind of showcases exactly what is going wrong with 40K right now. Just to be clear though, not a 40K hater, absolutely love it. I think aesthetically it looks great. I think the lore is fantastic. The setting is awesome. I've grown over the past 18 years to really love the setting. Wasn't a big fan of it at first when we first got into it, but now I just absolutely love it, having read so many novels, played so many video games. Looking forward to the TV series, everything. It's really a cool setting. And so of course we as fans want to see the best out of it. So let's address some of these problems. And of course this all comes back for me to the terrain. That to me, it was the biggest symptom. Not the thing that you fix it with, it's the biggest symptom of what is wrong with 40K right now. And what I mean by that is that in earlier editions of 40K, terrain did not play as big a part in whether the game would work. In other words, you could decide to have more or less terrain. You could set up your terrain in really cool cinematic and narrative ways, or you could just have hardly any of it on the table and have it be more of an open table, and the game would overall generally work. Obviously, having more terrain favors certain armies over others, such as close combat armies, because they can get shielded and get more cover saves. But in the end, the game worked regardless. You look at other games, let's look at Infinity, for example, and that game falls apart if you don't have any terrain, because the game was specifically designed to have a lot of terrain on the table, because every single model can react whenever anything that their opponent does happens. So if you move a model and your entire opponent's team can see that model, they can all shoot at it. So the game heavily relies on having terrain, but the game was designed with that in mind. And so we have to remember that games are designed with this in mind and sometimes without. But 40K, I feel like that's not the case. I feel like what we've seen happen now with the necessity to have all sorts of line of sight blocking terrain on the table is showing that there's a problem with the game, and not that the game was designed to have it. And that the way to fix it is with the Pariah Nexus or the UK tournament package rules of how you're supposed to lay out the terrain in really unrealistic and rather ugly ways, and very boring ways as well. And so let's talk about that. In this first video, I want to address what I think the problems are and what you, the player, can do to address them on your end. And then in the second video, maybe next week, I want to talk more directly to Games Workshop, as I'm sure they are working on 11th edition, because they tend to have a 3 or 4 year cycle right now, which would put it at next year. I don't have any insider information on that, that's just my guess. And what I would love to see happen in 11th edition to help bring back some of the elements that made the game really great before, but still retain some of the newer feels and the more modern style of gaming that we're seeing at this point. So let's go through some of those. And of course, this video is brought to you by us, the Ruins of Perdition. Well, I'm not the Ruins of Perdition, but we've made the Ruins of Perdition for you guys, and it is currently available for pre-order at miniwargaming.com/perdition. Ruins of Perdition is a modular, magnetizable, flat packing system that is super fast to print, super fast to paint, and is super easy to store. If you don't have a printer, no problem. We have really good bundles on that'll get you it as cheap as possible. And since it flat packs, it even ships nice and inexpensive throughout the entire world. So go check it out now at miniwargaming.com/perdition. For the next little while, you'll get the special Kickstarter prices, and then the prices will go up once it hits the store. Check it out. Let's go back to the video. So problem number one is that the terrain layouts are very boring and repetitive. This has been my biggest pet peeve because I love setting up narrative looking tables. And I have found that as I've tried to do my narrative campaigns, because that's the thing I love to do the most, that every time I would set up a narrative looking table, it would go very poorly. And that the one side that ever got to shoot first, so whoever got to roll and go first, would just decimate the opponent. I remember doing a narrative campaign. Unfortunately, this one never saw the light of day because there was a hard drive failure. But it was Tau versus Chaos Demons. And we did a bunch of games at 1,000 points, and it worked really well. And then for the last finale game, we did 2,000 points, and I had a really cool narrative looking table. In turn one, the Tau just wiped out 75% of the demons. which will come to one of the solutions that I have, which is to play smaller games, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. So because of this, you need to have kind of a similar layout. Sure, the Pariah Nexus and UK tournament packs show different layouts, but they're all just basically the same thing. Your L-shaped ruins and your U-shaped ruins covering a certain percentage of the table in very unrealistic ways. They don't actually represent reality. The roads don't line up in any way that makes sense, because if you were to use a cool mat that has roads that made sense, that would be long firing lines or lanes that people could abuse and would be really hard to play in. And the thing is, without tons of line of sight blockers, the game is too lethal. And that leads me to what I think is probably the biggest problem with 40K right now. And it's a combination of issues, but that the game is far too lethal. Now, there's a lot of reasons why it's too lethal, and so I'll list a few of them. First off, everything has far too many attacks. When you compare model to model of older editions to newer editions, for the most part, everything has more attacks, and those attacks typically have a higher strength and armor piercing value than they did before. And that's not universally true, but it's true often enough that you'll see the entire game becoming more lethal. When you combine that with the fact that now models they cost less in points, so you'll have more models on the table, and the standard size game has become universally 2,000 points, which boggles my mind, because back when we played earlier editions of 40K, 1,500 points was our standard, and tournaments went to 1,750, maybe 1,850. And that was as high as they went. And that was back in the day when models cost a lot more points. I did the math actually, that in 10th edition, what did it work out to be? It was an 1,100 point army, so 1,100 point army was the same as a 2,000 point army in 7th edition. That's a huge difference. 7th edition, 2,000 points was considered a big game. And that brings us to the next thing too, when it comes to lethality. The boards were bigger back then. You played on a 4-foot by 6-foot board, and now you're playing on the equivalent of 4 kill team mats. Because of course they want to sell the kill team mats, they changed the recommended, suggested, smallest size table to be multiples of their kill team mats. Now when I first saw that in 8th edition, I believe it was, I thought, oh, no problem, it says recommended, so we can still play on 4x6. But everybody quickly adopted that, and even lots of comments in our videos were like, you're playing the game wrong if you're playing on a 4-foot by 6-foot table. Now I think overall that sentiment has passed, and people don't bug us anymore about playing on 4-foot by 6-foot tables. But it was there for a very long time where people are like, no, you're playing it wrong. If you played on a 4-foot by 6-foot table, it changes how reserves come in from the sides or how much space there is at deep strike. The game was balanced for 2,000 points on a smaller table, which I doubt that's the case. I'm sure they did lots of play testing, but to say the entire game is balanced around that seems naive at best, I would say, considering that we see that the game, while maybe balanced at the competitive level, is not really balanced internally in the codexes or between them. And that's fine, I actually don't even care about that. When you go back to older editions, which I enjoy, those are far from balanced, and that's not what makes the game really good. And so that to me shows more of the lethality as well. Also, we have a lot more rerolls, we have a lot more models on the table because of the higher points value of the armies, plus combining that with the fact that each model costs less in points. And you're on a smaller table as well, so everything starts closer together and has a lot less space to maneuver around. So you end up just having more things, rolling more dice with a lot more rerolls. Everything is way more predictable. So if I'm going to take my shots with this unit, firing at that unit, I could probably calculate how many are going to die. Combine that with mortal wounds, which I don't think is a bad mechanic. I just think it's overused, that there's too many of them. And you need line of sight blocking terrain to make up for all of that. In fact, if you were to play a game where you got rid of terrain and both armies had a similar amount of shooting available to them, and one army wasn't just pure close combat, then really whoever goes first is going to most likely win. Whereas now it's the opposite, that with all the line of sight blocking terrain, you want to go second because you want your opponent to poke their head out and go after objectives so that you can then just fire at them. And to me, that just goes against the grain of what the game really was. I remember playing in older editions, and yes, I'm going to keep belly aching about older editions. I'm old, I get to do that. And I remember playing my Tyranids. Some of my list builds would be swarms of Tyranids that would just swarm across the table. And my opponent would get to kill like half of my guys before I got there, and yet if they didn't kill at least half my guys, when I got there I would be able to most likely win. And that felt very cinematic. You see the swarm of Tyranids coming across and the other side just like trying to shoot them all down and fight, or maybe like one jumps forward and starts going to melee because they're really good at it. And then you end up with these fights all over the place, and it just felt so cinematic. Rather than let's jump from cover to cover and line of sight blocking to line of sight blocking until we finally engage somewhere close to the middle. And to me, that just removes a lot of the cinematic aspects of 40K. And while I realize when you're in competitive play, you don't really think about that. I mean, you don't need to. At a tournament, it boils down to numbers, right? You forget all the thematic stuff, mostly. I'm not saying that they don't do it at all. But for the most part, you look at numbers, you look at which units are most efficient, you look at your secondaries, you look at all that kind of stuff, and you play the game as a game, which is perfectly fine. But I think that the majority of people, from my experience, from all the surveys, all the comments, all the interactions I've had with people, my gut instinct tells me that the vast majority of people who play miniature war games are not there to play a game. They're there to experience a thematic experience, like a narrative experience. That's what they want. They want to recreate something from the books or the movies or whatever. When I got into Lord of the Rings miniature game, the first thing that Dave and I wanted to do was recreate things from the movies, or at least things that felt like they could be in the movie, like a swarm of goblins going up the sides of a cliff and a bunch of elves at the top, or humans or dwarves or whatever defending their post, or things like that. Just those heroic last stands, or the Ride of the Rohirrim going out in a pincer maneuver to try to break through the enemy forces, or facing off against the Balrog and a bunch of goblins. And it was less about, do we have a perfectly balanced experience, and more about the cinematic experience of it all. And so I think that really was that is the reason that most people want to play any miniature war game. For the most part. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to that. And there are plenty of people who enjoy competitive, probably as well as narrative. And maybe some people who really only want the competitive as well, but that is not the majority. Now, because of all these problems, it leads us to the big thing, which is terrain. Terrain is used to fix the problems, but then it becomes a problem in and of itself. And the big problem with terrain is that because of the amount that you need, you end up needing to spend a lot of money, spend a lot of time painting it, and then take up a lot of space storing it. That's our problem with terrain. I love terrain, but even here at MiniWarGaming, where we have a big building to store stuff, storing terrain is one of our biggest storage issues. Miniatures can fit into nice little trays, and we can put tons of them on a shelf. But that same shelf can maybe hold 2 or 3 tables worth of terrain. And so that's a problem. Painting terrain also can be time consuming, just depending on the terrain that you get, and terrain can be rather expensive. We love to spend our time mostly on the models, buying them, painting them, showcasing them, because they really are the centerpiece of these games. And yet terrain is what makes everything really feel cinematic and narrative, and yet has the problem of too expensive, time consuming to paint, and taking up a lot of space. Now, of course, you can fix that, and I'm going to be a little biased here, by using modular terrain systems like Ruins of Perdition that we currently have available for pre-order right now if you go to miniwargaming.com/Predition. So, a little bias right there. But really, I designed that with all these problems in mind. That I'm like, people want modular terrain, but they also want it to not be too expensive. They want it to be easy to paint. And the big thing for us is they want it to be able to store well, so you could actually have this terrain at home. Because having terrain at home, like models at home is fine. You could pack those away into a little carry case and put it in a closet and you're fine. But terrain, yeah, good luck with that. You're going to leave that for the stores and the clubs that you go to. Well, now that's no longer the case. An entire table's worth of Ruins of Perdition terrain flat packs down into one little tray that is probably less space than the models that you needed to play on that same table. On top of that, especially during the pre-order, we have incredibly good prices on the printed terrain. Or if you have a 3D printer, we sell the STLs as well, so you can print it yourself and save even more money. So all that at miniwargaming.com/Predition. So there are ways to solve it. And it's not just Ruins of Perdition. You could probably buy certain like MDF terrain or maybe other 3D printable terrain. The only problem with a lot of those ones is that they won't flat pack afterwards. There are some systems that do it, but for the most part, once you've assembled them and painted them, they're going to take up a lot of space. So the solution that we have found for 10th edition 40K is to use a lot of terrain in a very specific way. But that really, to me, is just the symptom of the problem and not a solution to it. And so I really hope that we can fix this. So here are some suggestions that I have. I'll get to what I think you guys can do as players while we wait for 11th edition and hope that they'll correct a lot of these issues, which I'll talk more in another video. So number one, really consider playing smaller points games. When I played that narrative campaign of Tau versus Chaos Demons, when we were playing at 1,000 points, they actually worked quite well. I didn't have to have tons of line of sight blocking terrain. It just worked. It wasn't until we scaled up to 2,000 that these problems got out of hand. There is a critical mass of where shooting is going to get too good and too efficient. I always compare it to StarCraft. StarCraft is a very balanced game between Terran, Zerg, and Protoss. And if you look at their base unit, the Terran Marine, their little space marine, it costs 50 minerals to make, And 2 Zerglings cost 50 minerals to make as well, which if you're not sure what those are, that would be like a Space Marine versus 2 Hormigons. And if in a test you have them start apart and you actually attack, move them together, it's like 50-50 who's going to win, and whoever wins will have like a couple hit points left. Very well balanced. But when you scale it up, if you bring 100 Terran Marines versus 200 Zerglings, those 200 Zerglings never stand a chance because they have to close that gap while those 100 Marines are able to start firing, and that critical mass kills the front before the next ones can get in there. So there is a critical mass where shooting is going to outpace close combat. So consider playing at, I would actually say 1,000 points is a really good size. And it doesn't solve all the problems. You're still gonna need the right amount of terrain, but you can then start to play around with the terrain. And by the way, if you drop to 1,000 points, don't drop your table size in half like they suggest in the book. That's right, at 1,000 points, they actually suggest having half the size table, which is crazy because that's hardly any space at all. Keep it at the large size. Heck, even at the 4 foot by 6 foot size, at 1,000 points, it plays so freaking well. Even 1,500 points is an improvement, but 1,000 points is my favorite. Now, of course, it does mean that you can't bring out some of your big toys, like your super heavies or your more expensive units. And that's fine. You can still play at 2,000 points when you want to, and just accept that you're going to have that kind of experience. The other thing to consider, if you want to keep playing 40K, like obviously you can just say, well, I'll just go play other systems. I'll solve the problem by not playing 40K. But we're assuming that we're 40K fans here, which we are. And that is to consider trying out the older editions. That's what we've been doing here, and we have been having so much fun. It has reignited my love for Warhammer 40K. I was getting tired of 10th edition. I was ready to quit and be like, I don't want to play this game anymore. But then around here, we had Scary and Luca and Josh start playing older editions, especially 4th. And I went back and started playing 4th edition, and I had a blast. It just, not only was there nostalgia in it, going back and playing those earlier editions, but it corrects a lot of these problems. Introduces other ones that I'm glad are gone and have been fixed in 10th edition. But overall, I felt that the experience was a net positive in what you gained versus what you lost. 7th edition was the same. I've played 7th edition since then as well, and I've really, really enjoyed that, as long as you play earlier 7th edition. Late 7th edition got a little crazy. And so consider playing older editions of that if you don't want to switch from this game completely. There's not a lot of other solutions other than that, though. It's just a flaw that you have to accept if you're going to play 40K. If you try to go against it and say, I'm just going to make the table however I want, you are going to have a rough time. And that's why we designed Ruins of Perdition, because we're like, well, if you're going to have L-shaped ruins and U-shaped ruins and line of sight blocking terrain, it may as well look really good and give you the option to stack it up high so you can have really narrative looking terrain, and there's good scatter terrain in there and statues and walkways and craters and all sorts of stuff. So you can make that typical Pariah Nexus tournament terrain look really nice, which I'm very proud of the fact that we have done. So make sure you check that out, MiniWarGaming.com/Predition. And let me know in the comments what you think. What do you think any of my points are legit? Do you agree with them? Do you disagree? What would be your take on exactly what I'm saying here? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Happy wargaming.